Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
No one believed me. What would you do if everyone you loved smiled politely and told you that you were simply imagining things? The hardest part was not the mystery itself. It was watching my own family gently dismiss what I knew I had seen with my own eyes. For 2 days, I questioned my memory, my confidence, and even my own judgment. But what happened next proved that sometimes the smallest truth takes the longest time to believe. Stay with me because this story completely changed the way my family trusted one another, and it might change the way you see your own family too. My name is Emma, and this happened only a few weeks ago in the United States. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished grocery shopping and returned home while my husband was working from his home office, and our 2 children were finishing their homework at the kitchen table. Outside, our quiet neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. The mail carrier waved at me. A neighbor was trimming roses in her front yard. Everything felt peaceful. Nothing suggested that before sunset I would become the only person in my family who believed something unusual had happened. After putting away the groceries, I stepped outside to bring in a package that had been delivered near our front porch. As I picked it up, I noticed something across the street that immediately caught my attention. An older man was standing beside the large oak tree near the community mailbox. He wasn't doing anything strange, but he seemed to be searching carefully around the base of the tree. Every few seconds, he looked at a folded piece of paper in his hand, looked back at the ground, and then continued searching. I watched for nearly a minute before he suddenly smiled, picked up a small metal box hidden beneath the tree roots, placed it inside his backpack, and quietly walked away. It all happened so naturally that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. When my husband came downstairs for coffee, I casually mentioned what I had seen. He laughed kindly and said, maybe it was part of a neighborhood treasure hunt. Our son suggested it could have been a geocache. My daughter thought it sounded like a movie scene. Everyone smiled. I smiled too. But deep inside, something felt different. The man's expression had not looked playful. It had looked serious, almost emotional. That evening, during our usual family English reading time, my daughter practiced a short sentence from her beginner storybook. I saw what I saw. We all repeated it together because it was easy to pronounce. Somehow those 5 words stayed with me long after we closed the book. Learning English had become one of my favorite family traditions. Every evening we spent 20 minutes reading simple stories aloud. We laughed when someone mispronounced a word and celebrated every small improvement. Our favorite rule was simple. Progress is better than perfection. Looking back, I think that lesson applied to much more than language. Later that night, curiosity refused to leave me alone. Psychology researchers often explain something called the confidence gap. When several people disagree with us, our brains naturally begin doubting even memories that were originally very clear. I experienced that feeling completely. I kept asking myself whether I had misunderstood what I saw. Was it really a metal box? Was the man simply picking up something he had dropped? The more I questioned myself, the less certain I became. The next morning, I walked past the same oak tree while taking our dog for a walk. At first, everything looked ordinary. Then I noticed something unusual. The soil near the roots had been disturbed, and a tiny corner of laminated paper was still sticking out from beneath the leaves. I bent down and carefully pulled it free. It wasn't trash. It was part of a small waterproof card with faded writing that read, "If you find this, you're closer than you think." My heart started beating faster. I slipped the card into my jacket pocket and hurried home. Surely now my family would believe me. But when I showed them the card over breakfast, my husband smiled gently and said, "Emma, someone probably dropped it during a game." My children nodded in agreement. Once again, I was standing alone with what I believed was the truth. I looked out the kitchen window toward the oak tree, determined that I would prove I wasn't imagining any of it. What I didn't know was that before the week ended, one unexpected visitor would knock on our front door and say the exact words I had been waiting to hear. The small clues. Have you ever noticed that the more people tell you to forget something, the harder it becomes to stop thinking about it? That was exactly what happened to me. The mysterious card in my pocket should have been enough to satisfy my curiosity, yet every time I looked toward the old oak tree across the street, I felt as though it was quietly inviting me to uncover one more piece of a story that nobody else believed even existed. The next morning, after my husband left for a meeting and the children went to school, I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the front window. The oak tree looked completely ordinary again.
Cars passed by.
A woman pushed a stroller along the sidewalk. A delivery driver stopped briefly near the community mailbox. Nothing seemed unusual. I almost laughed at myself for becoming so interested in something that everyone else considered meaningless. Then I remembered the waterproof card still resting on the kitchen table. I picked it up once more. The words were short. If you find this, you're closer than you think. There was no company logo, no game instructions, and no contact information. It looked intentionally mysterious. I decided to walk back to the tree one more time, not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because my curiosity refused to disappear. Sometimes curiosity is stronger than confidence. Psychology researchers often explain that curiosity activates the brain's reward system, encouraging us to keep searching even when the answer seems unimportant. That simple idea suddenly described me perfectly. As I reached the oak tree, I looked around carefully. The neighborhood was quiet. A light breeze moved through the branches above me. I knelt near the roots and noticed several tiny footprints in the soft soil. They looked fresh. Beside them was something I had completely missed the day before, a small blue ribbon tied loosely around one of the lower branches. It was so subtle that most people would never notice it. I reached up and touched it gently. Attached to the ribbon was another tiny laminated tag. This one contained only 3 words. Keep looking ahead. My heart raced again. 2 hidden messages in the same place could not simply be an accident. I slipped the second tag into my pocket and hurried home. That evening during dinner, I showed both cards to my family. My son examined them carefully before smiling. "Mom," he said, "this really sounds like one of those outdoor puzzle games." My daughter agreed immediately. My husband remained calm. Maybe someone created a neighborhood adventure for kids. His explanation sounded reasonable. In fact, it sounded so reasonable that for a moment, I almost accepted it. Yet something still felt different. Neither card contained instructions or a prize. Instead, both messages felt deeply personal, almost encouraging. After dinner, we gathered in the living room for our nightly English reading practice. My daughter opened a beginner reader and read slowly. Look carefully before you decide. Everyone smiled at her pronunciation, but I quietly smiled for another reason. That simple sentence mirrored exactly what I had been trying to do. Learning English through short stories often gave me unexpected life lessons hidden inside easy vocabulary. Later that night, while washing dishes, I noticed movement outside the kitchen window. The same older man from 2 days earlier was walking past our house. This time, he wasn't carrying a backpack. Instead, he stopped beneath the oak tree, looked around briefly, smiled to himself, and continued walking without touching anything. I watched him disappear around the corner. My curiosity had officially become impossible to ignore. The following afternoon, I visited the neighborhood cafe to meet a friend. As we talked, I casually mentioned the strange cards and the older man. Before I could finish the story, the woman working behind the counter looked up from the coffee machine. Wait, she said quietly. Did you say the oak tree near the community mailbox? I nodded. She hesitated for a moment before adding something that made my heart skip a beat. You're not the first person to ask about that tree this month. Suddenly, I realized I might not be the only one who had noticed something unusual after all. The harder I tried, the less they believed. Isn't it strange how finding more evidence can sometimes make people believe you even less? I thought the conversation at the neighborhood cafe would finally prove I wasn't imagining everything. But instead it pulled me deeper into a mystery that made my own family look at me with even greater doubt. That was the moment I realized the story was no longer about a tree or a hidden message. It was becoming a test of trust, patience, and whether I could hold on to what I believed without letting frustration change who I was. The barista wiped her hands on a towel and leaned closer. A few people have asked about that oak tree recently, she said. They all mentioned finding little messages nearby. Before I could ask another question, a customer walked up to order coffee, and our conversation ended. She smiled apologetically and whispered, I don't know anything else. I just remember hearing people talk about it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince me that I wasn't alone. On my way home, I kept replaying her words. If several people had noticed the same thing, surely my family would finally take me seriously. As soon as everyone gathered for dinner that evening, I excitedly shared everything I had learned. My husband listened carefully, but when I finished, he gave me the same gentle smile I had already seen several times that week. Emma, he said kindly, it still sounds like some kind of local community activity. My son shrugged and added, maybe the cafe worker heard rumors from other people. That doesn't mean anything mysterious is happening. Even my daughter giggled and said, Mom, maybe you're starring in your own detective movie. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but only for a second. Inside, I felt surprisingly lonely. I wasn't angry with them. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply believed the simplest explanation, while I couldn't ignore the feeling that something more meaningful was unfolding. Social psychologists often describe something called the majority effect. When several people agree with one explanation, others naturally begin accepting it, even without strong evidence. I realized that evening I was experiencing the opposite side of that phenomenon. I was the only person defending a different idea, and suddenly I found myself questioning my own confidence again. After dinner, our family sat together for our usual English practice. We opened a simple storybook, and my daughter slowly read one sentence aloud. Sometimes the truth takes time. I smiled the moment I heard it. We repeated the sentence together several times, practicing pronunciation, but I secretly wondered whether those words were speaking directly to me. The following morning, curiosity pulled me back to the oak tree once again. This time I brought my phone, planning to take pictures of anything unusual. At first I found nothing. Then, just as I was about to leave, I noticed fresh chalk markings on the sidewalk leading away from the tree. They were small blue arrows, almost invisible unless you looked closely. I followed them for nearly half a block until they disappeared near a small public library. There, tucked behind a flower planter, I discovered another waterproof card. This one contained a different message. The answer begins where stories are shared. I stared at the words for several moments. Stories. Library. Community. The clues seemed connected, but I still couldn't understand how. I took several photographs before carefully placing the card back exactly where I had found it. When I returned home, I showed the pictures to my husband. He looked at them thoughtfully before saying, Emma, I know this is exciting for you, but maybe someone is simply creating a fun neighborhood game. His answer was calm, reasonable, and impossible to argue with. Yet my instincts still whispered that there was more waiting to be discovered. That afternoon, while organizing books in our living room, someone rang the front doorbell. I opened the door, expecting another package. Instead, an elderly woman I had never met stood on our porch holding a faded blue envelope. She looked at me for a long moment before asking a question that instantly sent chills through my body. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you the woman who's been following the messages near the old oak tree?" Learning to trust myself. What if the person who finally believed you was someone you had never met before? I stood frozen at my front door, staring at the elderly woman holding the faded blue envelope. For the first time since this strange story had begun, someone wasn't smiling politely or telling me I was overthinking. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes with the calm confidence of someone who already knew exactly why I had been searching. In that single moment, I felt both relieved and even more curious than ever. I invited her inside, and we sat together at the kitchen table while the afternoon sunlight filled the room. She introduced herself as Margaret, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in our neighborhood for nearly 30 years. Her voice was warm and gentle. Before opening the envelope, she asked me one simple question. "Why didn't you give up?" I smiled quietly before answering, because every clue felt real, even when nobody else believed me. Margaret nodded as though she had expected exactly that response. She explained that the little waterproof cards had been appearing around the neighborhood for several weeks. She had discovered two herself while walking her dog early in the mornings. At first, she ignored them, but eventually, her curiosity won. "Sometimes," she said softly, "our instincts notice patterns before our minds understand them." Those words stayed with me immediately. Modern psychology often explains that intuition isn't magic. Our brains quietly collect tiny details long before we consciously recognize them. That idea suddenly made perfect sense. Margaret carefully slid the blue envelope across the table. Inside was another laminated card, slightly older than the others. Across the front, in simple handwriting, were the words, "Truth grows stronger when it is shared." On the back was a small drawing of the neighborhood library. My heart raced. The library again. That couldn't be a coincidence. Just then, my husband walked into the kitchen after finishing work. He smiled politely at Margaret and listened as I explained everything she had told me. Margaret even showed him the card she had found. For a brief second, I thought this would finally change his mind. Instead, he smiled kindly and said, "Maybe someone organized a neighborhood kindness project. It actually sounds wonderful." His explanation wasn't unreasonable. In fact, it was thoughtful. But he still didn't believe there was any larger mystery behind it. I realized something important in that moment. Sometimes people don't reject our experiences because they don't trust us. They reject them because they already have an explanation that feels safe and complete. That evening, our family gathered in the living room for our daily English reading practice. My son chose a beginner story about friendship. One sentence caught everyone's attention. "Listen before you decide." We repeated it together several times, focusing on pronunciation. As I spoke the words aloud, they seemed less like an English exercise and more like advice for our family. Listening is often harder than speaking. The following afternoon, I decided to visit the neighborhood library alone. It was one of my favorite places in town, filled with cozy reading corners, friendly librarians, and families enjoying quiet afternoons together. I wandered slowly through the building, unsure what I was looking for. Then I noticed a bulletin board covered with handwritten community notes. Most announced book clubs or volunteer events. But tucked into one corner was a small blue card identical to the others. Beneath it, someone had written a short sentence. "Every story has a witness." Before I could examine it more closely, the librarian approached me with a warm smile. "You've been finding the cards too, haven't you?"
she asked.
My heart skipped a beat. I nodded. She glanced around to make sure nobody else was nearby before lowering her voice. There's someone you really need to meet, she whispered. He's been waiting for the person who refused to stop searching. At that exact moment, an older gentleman slowly stood up from a reading table across the room. He smiled as though he had recognized me long before I noticed him. Then he lifted a small metal box onto the table, the very same kind of box I had watched the mysterious man retrieve beneath the oak tree on that unforgettable Tuesday afternoon. The stranger knew the truth. What if the mysterious man you had been quietly watching was never hiding from you at all, but waiting for you to find him? As the older gentleman gently placed the small metal box on the library table, my heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the sounds around me. Every clue I had collected over the past week suddenly pointed toward this single moment. I wasn't imagining the story anymore. Someone else had been living inside it long before I arrived. The gentleman smiled warmly and motioned for me to sit down. My name is Daniel, he said. I've been wondering who would be curious enough to follow every message. His voice carried the calm confidence of a retired teacher. There was nothing mysterious or frightening about him anymore. Instead, he seemed relieved that someone had finally reached the end of the trail. I looked at the familiar metal box resting between us. Is this the same box I saw beneath the oak tree? I asked. Daniel nodded.
Yes. I placed it there many times.
I couldn't hide my surprise.
Why?
He smiled before answering. Because sometimes people need to rediscover curiosity before they can rediscover trust. That sentence stayed with me immediately. Daniel explained that several years earlier, after losing his wife, he had struggled with loneliness. Instead of isolating himself, he started creating small neighborhood kindness adventures. He hid encouraging messages around the community, hoping strangers would smile, think, and perhaps begin conversations with one another. The cards were never meant to confuse people. They were meant to reconnect neighbors who had slowly stopped noticing each other. I listened carefully, fascinated by the simplicity of the idea. The clues always lead somewhere meaningful, Daniel continued. Not to treasure, but to people. Suddenly, everything began making sense. The oak tree connected neighbors. The library connected readers. The cafe connected conversations. Every clue encouraged human connection rather than competition. Positive psychology often explains that meaningful social interactions increase happiness far more than material rewards. Daniel's project quietly demonstrated that principle every single day. Just then my phone buzzed. My husband had sent a simple message asking where I was. Instead of trying to explain everything through text, I invited him to the library. 20 minutes later he arrived, still looking slightly confused. Daniel welcomed him with a friendly handshake and patiently shared the entire story from the beginning. My husband listened without interrupting. Occasionally, he glanced toward me with an expression I hadn't seen all week. It wasn't doubt anymore. It was understanding. When Daniel finished speaking, my husband smiled sheepishly. Emma, he said softly, I think I owe you an apology. Those words meant more to me than I expected. I wasn't happy because I had been right. I was happy because he was willing to listen. Family therapists often say that healthy relationships are strengthened not by avoiding misunderstandings, but by repairing them with honesty and humility. Sitting there together, I finally understood exactly what they meant. Before we left, Daniel opened the metal box. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards, each carrying a short message of encouragement. He invited both of us to choose one without looking. Mine read, "Keep believing in gentle truths." My husband said, "Listen carefully. Someone loves you enough to tell you what they see." We looked at each other and laughed. The messages felt almost perfectly chosen, even though they had been selected completely at random. That evening, our family gathered once again for English reading practice. This time, my husband chose the sentence. He smiled at me before reading slowly, "I believe you." Our children repeated the words with bright smiles, unaware that those 3 simple English words carried the biggest lesson our family had learned all week. As bedtime approached, I believed the mystery had finally ended. Then Daniel called my phone. His normally calm voice sounded unusually serious. "Emma," he said quietly, while organizing the last few boxes tonight, "I found something that wasn't placed there by me." I felt my heart skip a beat. Someone else has been leaving clues, and I think they were meant specifically for you. The truth begins to shine. What if the biggest surprise wasn't discovering who left the clues, but realizing that someone had quietly been watching your kindness all along? Daniel's late-night phone call stayed in my mind long after I hung up. His voice had sounded completely different from the calm, reassuring tone I had grown used to. If the mysterious cards inside the metal box had not been placed there by him, then someone else had continued the story without anyone knowing. Suddenly, the mystery I believed was solved became even deeper than before. Early the next morning, my husband insisted on coming with me to the library. That simple decision meant more than he probably realized. For the first time since everything had started, I no longer felt like I was searching alone. The drive across our neighborhood was quiet. Autumn leaves drifted across the streets, children waited for school buses, and people walked their dogs just as they did every morning. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. Yet I couldn't stop wondering how many ordinary moments hide extraordinary stories that nobody notices. Daniel was already waiting when we arrived. The small metal box sat on the reading table exactly where we had left it the previous day. Beside it rested a plain white envelope with no name written on the front. "This wasn't here yesterday," Daniel explained. "When I opened the cabinet this morning, I found it beneath the box." He carefully handed it to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was short. "If you reach this point, you pass the real test." Most people stopped after the first clue. You kept searching because you believed what your heart noticed before your eyes understood. I looked up in complete silence. My husband leaned closer and quietly reread the letter himself. There was no signature.
No explanation.
Only one small symbol at the bottom, a tiny drawing of an oak leaf. Daniel frowned. "I've never seen this before," he admitted. "I didn't write it." My husband slowly looked at me. This time there was no doubt in his eyes. "Emma," he whispered, "you were right from the very beginning." Hearing those words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. But strangely, proving myself right no longer felt like the most important part of the journey. I had learned something much more valuable. Research in relationship psychology suggests that emotional validation, the simple act of feeling heard and believed, strengthens trust far more deeply than simply winning an argument. Sitting there beside my husband, I finally understood that truth. He wasn't apologizing because he had lost a disagreement.
He was choosing to believe in me.
As we talked, Daniel suddenly remembered something. Several months earlier, a local photography club had organized a community project encouraging neighbors to leave anonymous messages of kindness throughout town. The project had officially ended after only a few weeks. That possibility somehow made the story even more beautiful. Kindness had become contagious. Before leaving the library, Daniel asked if we would like to help refill the metal box with new encouraging messages for future visitors. My husband smiled immediately. Absolutely. Together we spent nearly an hour writing short notes. Mine simply read, "Trust yourself, but stay kind." My husband said, Listen before you decide. As we slipped them into the box, it felt as though our own family had become part of the story that had first brought us together. That evening, our children eagerly asked what had happened at the library. Instead of explaining everything at once, we invited them to help with English practice first. My daughter opened her beginner reader and slowly pronounced today's sentence. Kindness grows when people share it. We repeated it together several times. This time the words felt wonderfully real. Later that night, while placing the mysterious envelope safely inside our bookshelf, something unexpected fell onto the floor. It wasn't the letter. It was a small photograph that had somehow been tucked inside the envelope without any of us noticing. The picture showed the old oak tree many years earlier. And standing beneath it was a young woman smiling directly at the camera while holding the exact same metal box in her hands. On the back of the photograph, someone had written only one sentence. Find her, and you'll finally understand why your family needed this story. We searched together. What if the person you had been trying so hard to convince suddenly became your greatest partner? The old photograph resting in my hands changed everything. For the first time since this mysterious journey had begun, my husband wasn't asking whether I had misunderstood something. Instead, he leaned closer, studied every tiny detail in the picture, and quietly said, "Let's find her together." Those 4 words meant more to me than solving the mystery itself. They meant my family finally believed in me. The following Saturday morning, the 4 of us walked back to the neighborhood library carrying the photograph in a protective folder. The children were surprisingly excited. To them, it felt like a real-life treasure hunt. To me, it had become something much deeper. It was no longer about proving I had been right. It was about discovering why this strange chain of kindness had somehow chosen our family. Daniel welcomed us with his usual warm smile. When he saw the photograph, however, his expression changed immediately. He adjusted his glasses and stared at it for several long seconds. "I remember her," he whispered. "Her name was Hannah." My heart skipped a beat. Finally, we had a name. Daniel explained that Hannah had volunteered in the neighborhood many years earlier. She loved books, organized children's reading events, and believed that simple words could change lives. She often encouraged families to read together, especially parents learning English alongside their children. She used to say that every new word builds a stronger family conversation, Daniel recalled with a smile. Hearing those words felt strangely familiar because our own family had spent years reading simple English stories together every evening. Perhaps we had been following the same philosophy without ever knowing it. Daniel searched through several old community photo albums stored in the library archives. Most contained pictures of neighborhood events, volunteer projects, and reading clubs. Then he stopped on one page and pointed carefully. There was Hannah again, standing beneath the same oak tree, surrounded by smiling families holding small handwritten cards. Across the top of the page was a title, The Trust Tree Project. Daniel slowly explained its purpose. Years ago, families were invited to leave anonymous notes of encouragement around the neighborhood. The goal was simple: help strangers believe that kindness still existed in everyday life. Children searched for messages during walks. Parents discussed them together. Neighbors who had never spoken before suddenly became friends. It wasn't a game. It was a community tradition built on hope. As I listened, I finally understood why every clue had led to places where people gathered: the library, the cafe, the community mailbox, and the old oak tree. They were all places where conversations naturally began. Positive psychology consistently shows that shared positive experiences strengthen relationships and improve emotional well-being. Hannah had transformed that scientific principle into something beautifully simple. She had turned kindness into an adventure. My husband looked at me, and smiled. "Emma," he said quietly, "you didn't just discover a mystery. You rediscovered a forgotten tradition." Those words filled me with unexpected pride. Our children became fascinated by the old photographs. My daughter pointed at one smiling family and asked whether they also practiced English together. Daniel laughed warmly. "Many of them did," he answered. "Some families came here every week just to read one new story together." On the way home, our son suggested we continue the trust tree project ourselves. The idea immediately excited everyone. That evening, instead of watching television, we sat around the dining table writing short, encouraging notes in simple English. One card read, "Keep going. You're doing better than you think." Another said, "Believe in yourself today." The children decorated each one with colorful drawings. It became one of the happiest family evenings we had shared in months. Just before bedtime, someone slipped an envelope through our front door mail slot. There was no stamp, no address, and no return name. Only 5 handwritten words appeared across the front. "Thank you for continuing Hannah's dream." Inside was a single newspaper clipping dated almost 15 years earlier. The headline immediately made my heart race because it revealed one astonishing fact none of us had expected. Hannah had disappeared from the neighborhood without saying goodbye. The proof we never expected. What if the answer you had been chasing wasn't hidden in the future, but waiting quietly inside the past? The old newspaper clipping lay on our kitchen table while the entire family stared at it in silence. Across the front page was a smiling photograph of Hannah standing beneath the familiar oak tree during a neighborhood reading festival nearly 15 years earlier. But it was the headline that captured all of our attention. "Local volunteer leaves a lasting legacy before sudden departure." The article didn't describe a disappearance the way my imagination had first feared. Instead, it explained that Hannah had accepted an unexpected opportunity to work with literacy programs in another state. She had left quickly, leaving behind the Trust Tree Project with the hope that neighbors would continue it together. For reasons nobody could explain, the tradition slowly faded over the years until only scattered memories remained. I exhaled slowly, realizing how easily fear can fill empty spaces when we don't know the complete story. My husband smiled at me across the table. "It's amazing," he said quietly. "The truth is almost always kinder than the stories we invent." His words stayed with me all morning. Researchers who study cognitive psychology often explain that the human brain dislikes uncertainty. When information is missing, we naturally create explanations, even if they aren't true. Looking back over the past week, I realized I had done exactly that more than once. Yet curiosity had eventually guided me toward understanding instead of fear. Later that afternoon, Daniel called with exciting news. While organizing old library records, he had discovered a storage box containing the original Trust Tree journals. Families who participated years ago had written about their experiences, describing how the project encouraged children to read, neighbors to connect, and parents to spend more time talking together. He invited us to see them. The journals were beautiful. Some entries were only a few sentences long. Others filled several pages. One father wrote that his shy daughter had gained confidence by reading each hidden message aloud. Another family described taking evening walks together for the first time in years while searching for kindness cards. Reading those stories made me realize something important. The real treasure had never been the clues. It had always been the conversations they created. Our own family had changed in exactly the same way. We listened more carefully now. We laughed more often. We questioned each other with curiosity instead of judgment. That evening, during our usual English reading practice, my daughter chose a sentence from one of her favorite beginner books. "Every story teaches something." We repeated it together several times. Then my son added another sentence he had learned at school. The best lessons are shared. Both simple expressions suddenly carried a deeper meaning than ever before. Before leaving the library, Daniel handed me one final folder. Inside was a letter written by Hannah shortly before she moved away. She thanked the community for believing that small acts of kindness could create lasting friendships. Near the end of the letter she wrote, "If the trust tree ever grows again, it won't be because of me. It will be because another family chooses to care." I looked at my husband, and neither of us needed to say anything. We already knew exactly what we wanted to do. The following weekend, our children helped us prepare dozens of colorful encouragement cards. We placed them around the neighborhood exactly as Hannah once had.
Simple message.
Simple words.
Simple hope.
By sunset, we noticed something beautiful. Families stopped to read them. Children smiled. Neighbors who had never spoken before began introducing themselves. The Trust Tree Project was quietly coming back to life. Just as we prepared to head home, an elderly woman approached us, carrying one of our cards. She smiled warmly and said, "I've been waiting 15 years to thank the family who would bring this tradition back." Then she reached into her purse and handed me a small sealed envelope. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 6 unforgettable words. Open this only with your whole family. What I really needed to prove. What if the greatest proof wasn't showing your family that you were right, but showing them why your heart never gave up? That sealed envelope sat in the center of our dining table all evening. My husband looked at it, the children stared at it with excitement, and I couldn't stop wondering why a complete stranger had waited 15 years to hand it to the family that restarted the Trust Tree Project. We agreed on one simple rule. No one would open it until all 4 of us were sitting together, just as the message requested. After dinner, we gathered in the living room. The television stayed off. Our phones rested quietly on the bookshelf. Somehow the room felt more peaceful than usual, as if the story itself wanted our full attention. I carefully broke the old seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. To the family who chose curiosity instead of certainty, it began, "If you're reading this together, then the trust tree has already succeeded again." I smiled before continuing. The letter explained that Hannah had asked several close friends to preserve small parts of the project after she moved away. None of them knew which family would eventually rediscover it. Their only responsibility was to wait until they saw a family working together with kindness, patience, and genuine curiosity. Only then were they supposed to deliver the final letter. Suddenly, every mysterious moment made perfect sense. The clues had never been testing intelligence. They had been quietly revealing character. My husband gently squeezed my hand as I continued reading aloud. "You may think this journey was about solving a mystery," the letter said. "It was actually about strengthening the conversations inside your own home." Those words immediately brought tears to my eyes. Looking around at my husband and our children, I realized how much our family had changed during the past few weeks. We interrupted each other less. We asked more questions before making assumptions. We laughed more often over simple things. Somehow, searching together had brought us closer than finding the answer ever could. Family researchers often describe something called shared meaning. Healthy families create emotional strength not because they avoid challenges, but because they build meaningful stories together. Without realizing it, our mysterious adventure had become exactly that kind of story. Every future family gathering would include memories of the oak tree, the hidden cards, the library, Daniel, Margaret, and Hannah. They had all become part of our family's identity. My daughter quietly asked, "Mom, does this mean you finally proved you were right?" I smiled before answering, "No, I said softly. I proved something much more important. Everyone looked at me curiously. I proved that it's worth trusting your heart while still treating other people with kindness. My husband nodded immediately. And I learned that believing someone you love is more valuable than always finding the quickest explanation. Our son smiled and added, "So, everybody learned something." We all laughed together. During our English reading practice that evening, we chose perhaps the simplest sentence we had ever practiced. Trust takes time. We repeated it several times until even our youngest daughter could pronounce every word confidently. Then we added another sentence together. Kindness makes families stronger. Those two short expressions felt like the perfect summary of everything we had experienced. Before bedtime, we placed Hannah's letter, the old photograph, and the newspaper clipping into a new scrapbook beside the Trust Tree journals. We wanted future generations of our family to understand that ordinary moments can become extraordinary memories when people choose patience over.
Pride.
Just as I closed the scrapbook, a small folded note slipped out from between two pages. I frowned because none of us had seen it before. It was newer than everything else, written on fresh paper with modern ink. Across the front were 8 handwritten words that made my heart race one final time. Tomorrow morning, meet me beneath the oak tree. There was no signature, only a tiny blue leaf drawn in the corner, exactly like the symbol that had started this unforgettable journey. The greatest proof was love. What if the final answer waiting beneath the old oak tree wasn't another mystery to solve, but a reminder that the people closest to you are the greatest treasure you'll ever find? As the sun slowly rose over our quiet neighborhood the next morning, my family and I walked together toward the familiar tree. The streets were peaceful. Birds sang softly from the branches above us, and for the first time since this journey had begun, I wasn't walking with questions. I was walking with gratitude. Whatever happened next, I already knew this story had changed our family forever. When we reached the oak tree, we saw someone waiting quietly beside it. It was Daniel. He smiled warmly as we approached, but this time he wasn't carrying the small metal box. Instead, he held a young oak sapling wrapped carefully in burlap. "Good morning," he said. "I hoped you'd come." I looked around, surprised. "Did you write the note?" Daniel shook his head with a gentle laugh.
No.
"But I know who did." Before I could ask another question, Margaret appeared from the opposite side of the park carrying a small watering can. Soon the librarian arrived, followed by several neighbors we had met throughout the week. Even the barista from the cafe joined the group. One by one, smiling families gathered beneath the tree. Children laughed together while adults greeted one another like old friends. Daniel looked at all of us before speaking. Years ago, Hannah believed that neighborhoods become stronger when strangers become neighbors. When she left, she asked us to keep hoping another family would someday bring the Trust Tree Project back to life. He smiled toward us. That family turned out to be yours. My husband quietly squeezed my hand. I felt tears forming again, but this time they were tears of joy. Daniel handed the young oak tree to our children. "Would you help us plant this?" he asked. Together we dug a small hole beside the original oak tree. As the children carefully placed the young sapling into the ground, I realized we weren't simply planting another tree. We were planting another beginning. Community psychologists often explain that shared traditions strengthen both families and neighborhoods by creating a sense of belonging. Looking around at everyone smiling together, I understood exactly what they meant. Sometimes one simple tradition can quietly transform an entire community. After the tree had been planted, Daniel handed me a small wooden plaque. It read, "The Trust Tree lives here." Beneath those words was a second sentence that touched my heart even more. Believe first. Understand together. I knew immediately that those words would remain with our family for the rest of our lives. That evening, our living room felt warmer than ever before. During our daily English reading practice, our daughter chose one final sentence from her favorite beginner book. Family means believing in each other. We all repeated it together, smiling after every word. Then my son suggested adding another sentence of our own. Together we slowly said, "Kindness changes everything." Those simple English sentences had become much more than language lessons. They had become family promises. Looking back now, I smile whenever I remember the first day I saw the mysterious man beneath the oak tree. At the time, I believed I was chasing a strange secret that nobody else could understand. In reality, I was walking toward one of the greatest lessons of my life. I never truly needed to prove that I was right. I needed to remind my family and myself that listening, trusting, and staying curious are far more powerful than winning an argument. Every hidden card, every conversation, every unexpected meeting, and every moment of doubt quietly led us toward each other. Today, our family still walks past the old oak tree almost every weekend. We still leave encouraging messages for strangers to discover. We still read simple English stories together every evening. And every time I see another family smiling beneath those branches, I remember that extraordinary journeys often begin with ordinary moments that most people walk right past. If my story leaves you with one thought today, let it be this: when the people you love don't immediately understand you, don't stop speaking with kindness. Truth may take time, but trust grows strongest when patience leads the way. Sometimes the greatest proof isn't evidence at all. Sometimes the greatest proof is the family that chooses to stand beside you in the end.